Listening in. Here we go. There's recording now. Everything should be good now. There we go. All right. Personal freedom lesson 4 in your books. It will be starting on page 104. The meaning of freedom. We're going to start with a video of Betty's case, going back to the year 1857. Enjoy for a moment. And then this will be our opening case study for today. Yeah.
Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, people were brutally kidnapped from Africa and forced into slavery in the American colonies. By the mid-19th century, however, the United States was fiercely disunited over the practice of slavery. The southern states built their entire economy on the exploitation of people as slaves, whereas the northern states had abolished the practice as a contradiction to the right of every human to be free. This friction led to the Civil War of 1861. But just 4 years shy of the war, and just 8 years before slavery was permanently abolished throughout the United States, a Massachusetts court faced a slavery case with an unusual twist. The defendant, Lewis and Laura Sweet, who lived in a city where slavery was still legal and prevalent. During their travels, the Sweets were in the habit of taking along their black slave, a lady by the name of Betty. In 1857, the Sweets toured Canada and various northern states, but when they arrived in Lawrence, a city in the abolitionist state of Massachusetts, they ran into trouble. Local anti-slavery activists recoiled at the sight of a woman of color accompanying her white master and mistress. They demanded that the Sweets set Betty free. The couple claimed that they would not retain Betty against her will, but that Betty was not seeking her freedom. The activists then turned to Betty. They begged her to assert her rights and to refuse to return to Tennessee with the Sweets, but Betty brushed them away. One Lawrence activist, a widow named Lucy Schuyler, petitioned the Boston courts to intervene. The case, referred to simply as Betty's case, was heard by Massachusetts Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw, a deep thinker with considerable influence on the development of American law. Shaw requested the parties' consent to interview Betty in private. He reported,
I proposed and had an examination of the said Betty, apart from the said Sweet and wife, and all other persons, upon which it appeared to me that she is 25 years old, intelligent, and capable of judging for herself, that she has a husband in Tennessee and other relatives, that she is much attached to Mr. and Mrs. Sweet, is very well treated by them, and desires to remain and return with them. And this desire she expressed decisively, and upon repeated inquiries. I explained to her her right to freedom and protection here, and that she could not lawfully be taken away against her will.
The judge found himself in a quandary. Under the laws of his state, slavery was illegal and wrong. On the other hand, Betty insisted that she wished to remain with her masters. Betty's freedom appeared to be pitted against her free choice. Judge Shaw opted for the free choice argument.
It was contrary to all the principles of freedom that this or any other person should not exercise a free choice in such a matter. Betty was entirely at liberty to exercise her free choice, and no one could interfere with her without incurring a personal liability. Wherefore it was ordered and adjudged that the said Betty be at free liberty to remain with Mr. and Mrs. Sweet, or go elsewhere at her free choice, and that all persons be interdicted and forbidden to interfere with her personal liberty in this respect.
The underlying dilemma of Betty's case rings louder and lingers longer than an individual judge's decision. Should an individual be free to choose to be a slave?
All right, that's the opening case of today's class. This case about Betty, who belongs to this sweet couple, right? The Sweets. And she chooses to want to remain a slave. So in your opinion, should a person be free to choose to be a slave? Yes or no? Let's take a vote.
No.
If it's
Yes.
uncle revealed, how can the,
If,
she's the slave? If she
Okay.
doesn't reveal,
That's her choice.
all right, we're gonna ask yes or no. That's all I want to hear. I don't want to hear
Yes.
opinions.
Yes. Yes.
No.
Yes? No. Rojo says no. Anybody says no?
No.
Everybody else says yes?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes
Nobody should be slave, even on your own will, huh?
Nobody.
Yes and no.
Yes and no. That's a Jewish answer, yes or no?
It's a free choice. We have a choice.
All right, we'll see. Well, because we want to see is what would Jewish law say in this case. That's interesting, and we are going to open up this class with freedom. On Zoom, do you hear me clear? Thumbs up. All right. So the question is, should a person be free to choose to be a slave? And in text 2, we're going to introduce two theories of freedom. I'm going to ask our lawyer Mark to read us text 2, page 106, loud and clear.
Negative liberty is the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints. One has negative liberty to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative sense. Positive liberty is the possibility of acting or the fact of acting in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. The idea of distinguishing between a negative and a positive sense of the term liberty goes back at least to Kant and was examined and defended in depth by Isaiah Berlin in the 1950s and 1960s.
All right, so we have two definitions of freedom, negative liberty and positive liberty. Make this very simple. Negative liberty means freedom from constraints, meaning our objective is, what did I do? The objective is what? To be free from slavery, free from something holding me back. Positive liberty emphasizes more than that. Not just we are concerned about a person's well-being to be free from somebody else or something holding them back, but to actually freedom to realize one's purpose, to go further. And we want to give them the opportunity to really live their full purpose. It's more negative versus positive. So bending on these two, the question is, which of these definitions of freedom resonates more with you when we talk about liberty? Are we more concerned by negative liberty or positive liberty? Positive liberty?
Yeah.
Okay. And let's just jump in. Based on negative definition of liberty, right? Freedom, it's more freedom from or freedom to. Freedom from slavery or freedom to live a life full of freedom. If we're focusing on freedom from, then we can say, does Betty have her freedom to remain a slave if she chooses? Possible, because as long as she's not forced to, that's fine. Someone on Zoom is making lots of noise. Okay, so, and versus if we're focusing more on the next step, positive liberty, then we would say maybe that Betty should not be a slave, because that's, at the end of the day, it's limiting her true freedom as living as a free person. Yes.
Negative liberty, you have there is a picture of a physical restraint.
Yeah.
And this talks about restraint.
Mhm.
What about mental restraint?
That will all comes into play as well. Yes.
Any kind of restraint.
And we're gonna see that when we're gonna talk more about labor laws, right? And it's gonna get interesting. So we're just going step by step, and we're gonna now jump into now we're answering the question. We're just giving a case. We're giving two approaches in terms of how we see liberty. And now we're gonna say, what does Torah have to say about liberty in general? What's fascinating is what it took the world, just last 100 years or so to that we talk about our freedoms, our real freedoms. Slavery was prevalent till how many years ago?
1950s.
Huh?
70s.
In the South? To what age? To what? When was slavery abolished in the South?
1864.
Right.
That was theoretical.
Huh? Theoretical. Exactly. But what Torah's view on freedom has been around for 3,000 years. What we are catching up today is what Torah already taught us thousands of years, which back then for sure was not common at all. Was not the norm. So what is the Jewish? Let's go to the Jewish source. First, how does Judaism define freedom? A very shocking statement in the Mishnah, text 3. The Mishnah says, no person is free except for those who occupy themselves with Torah. What does that mean? According to this text, only Torah, which is the manual for life with 613 commandments, how to live life, it can make a person free. Why is that? Because that sounds kind of sounds like a contradiction. So let's go back. How did we become a people? So we just celebrate Shavuot, right? Where we got the Torah, we got the 10 Commandments, and we got all the other commandments. We were 7 weeks earlier, before the Jews were at Sinai, we were slaves. For 210 years, we were slaves, and we became a free people. And what does Moses tell Pharaoh? Let my people go. And on Shabbat, yesterday I spoke about, but what was this? But that's not where the sentence stopped. He always told them, let my people go. But to continue, look at text 4. I'm sorry, not text 4, it's not here. So they may serve God. So they may serve God. So basically, we went from becoming free from a enslavement of Pharaoh to, so to speak, to become enslaved to God. We didn't become fully free. In text 4 in Leviticus, we read, the children of Israel belong to me as servants. They are my servants who I brought out of Egypt. I am your God. What does that mean? The Talmud explains in text 5, the children of Israel belong to me as servants. With this verse, God is saying they are my servants, not servants to other servants. God in the Torah is very clear that he doesn't want people to be servants, to be slaves. Although we do find slave laws in Torah, which is very, the way it's brought in is a very last resort. And we're going to see that, how did that happen? But without going into slavery laws in Torah, which is more like servitude, there's a difference of being a slave or being a servant to somebody. Yeah. In Torah, when we call what they translate slavery, is more like a servant, somebody who decides or is being sold because they are so poor and they did a crime and they have to pay up, so they take their labor as a compensation. But even then, the Torah puts a very limited amount of time that they're allowed to be so. The Torah is not happy about it. The Torah says we have to treat that person more than the master. In other words, for example, if the master has one pillow in his house, he must give it to his servant. He cannot sleep on that one pillow. Meaning, I think the point is that Torah puts a very strong emphasis and doesn't want any person to be ever limited in their freedom. The servitude in Torah is very, very last resort. And Torah does not like it. But let's focus on back on the story of Egypt. All right. So we have this Exodus idea. Let's move here. Who defines a person's purpose, anyways? And we say God freedom from Egypt, right? For what? For the Torah. What is the Torah? Torah is the manual that teaches us to live life purposefully, to live life to its fullest. So in other words, which approach does the Torah take? Negative freedom or positive freedom? Positive freedom, right? Positive freedom. Meaning God is only concerned that you should not become shackled down by an oppressor, but God wants you really to live life to its fullest. And the way we, as Jews, were taught what is life, living to full freedom, is living a life of Torah. God, who knows what's best for us, wants us to live a life of purpose and meaning. So that's text 6. Who wants to read text 6? We need a volunteer. Picking Susanna. Page 110.
Service of God is not something that stifles the identity of a Jew. That would be. On the contrary, divine service is very core of every Jewish being. This is the meaning of the sage's teaching, that no person is free except for those who occupy themselves with Torah. Even though Torah observance is term service, term
Mhm.
service, observing Torah, and it's what in the same nature of a job as a Mishnah teaches. I was created to serve my Creator. Only when serving God is a Jew truly free.
All right, so freedom is a foundational Jewish value. Our birth as a nation began once we were liberated, right? But it is, we remember our liberation every day. Where? We say the Shema. We say in the Shema, remember for taking us out of Egypt. When we make Kiddush on Shabbos, we always talk about the Exodus. Remember, God has taken us out of Egypt. It is a fundamental idea that we wake up every morning to strive to be our fullest free person that we can be, the way God intended it to be. How so? By living a life with Jewish values, with Jewish morals, with the Torah and its mitzvot. Right? We dedicate a Seder to celebrate freedom. That is the whole idea. True freedom is through the Torah laws, as we learn the ethics of our Father. Laws, how does law make us free? So we answered that the linkage between freedom and Torah goes back to the freedom that makes us a nation. So wasn't this freedom just a transfer of ownership from Pharaoh to God? So we said, yes, but if we look at it as negative liberty, freedom from subjugation to the Egyptians, but we look at it as a positive liberty, where God wants us to live life to its fullest purpose. The freedom to be oneself is what it's all about. This was the introduction to the Jewish view on freedom. And we take freedom to an extreme. We're going to see soon how. So, because this is kind of more in a religious setting, right? Freedom means, right? Okay, I got to serve God. I have my mitzvahs to do every day. That's my freedom. But God takes the freedom much further when it applies to how we interact with each other. And this brings us to the next part of this class, and that is about debt recovery. In case study A, we're going to bring out a case that was actually asked many, many years ago. This is from a book written about 800 years ago. And this is a case between two Jews, right? And that is on page 112. Judaism takes money very serious. If we owe money to somebody, it is a very, very important mitzvah to repay them. Right? It's like there was a Jewish guy who was an investment business executive, and I'm sorry, it was a Jewish guy who was learning to be a lawyer. We'll call him not Mark with a K. Mark with a K. And he was interviewing for and he was interviewing for a job. And then he came to this big law firm, and the principal lawyer says, "So Mark, are you an honest lawyer?" And he says, "Honest? Of course I'm honest. I paid back my father. He loaned me $15,000 for my education, and I paid back every single penny to him." I said, "Oh, that's impressive." Yeah, after he sued me for the money. That sounds Jewish. All right, so let's get into the case study A. Reuven borrows money from Shimon and failed to repay the loan. Reuven now is living with a relative, where he eats good food and dons expensive clothing. His wife is similarly expensively attired and even provides gifts to her friends. Reuven claims that all of this is provided by his relative, whereas he personally is penniless. He sits idle and refuses to engage in any labor or business of the type he always performed in the past, because he knows that any money he earns will necessarily go towards repaying his loan. So you be the judge. What would be your decision if such a case came before you?
What are the choices?
Huh?
What are the choices?
You're the judge. You have all the choice in front of
He
you.
has to
You're the
pay
judge.
back.
He has to pay back, we all agree. He doesn't have the money. So he decides what?
How could you say you must?
So first, he's living a good life, right? He's living by his rich uncle, right? But he says, not my money. I don't have any money. He doesn't want to go to work because he doesn't work. The money he earns, he'll have to pay back, right? He's not a mensch. He's not a mensch at all, right?
Right.
But why are we asking for the legal definition? You're the judge. What would you do? What do you do? Would you force him to go to work?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But he says no, because you can't.
How do you force somebody?
Huh?
How do you force somebody to?
Oh, good question. How do you force someone to work?
Under 65 hours.
All right, let's keep this open. Let's do case study B. All right, Mr. Britton. I signed a contract to work for Mr. Turner. So this happened in 1834 in New Hampshire. This came to the New Hampshire Superior Court. So Mr. Britton signed a contract to work for Mr. Turner for 1 year, for which he would be paid $120 in total, equaling $10 per month. But Britton ceased working after 9 months, and Turner was only able to find a replacement worker for the remaining 3 months for $45, equaling $15 per month. Turner did not pay Britton anything for his uncompleted contract, and Britton sued to collect pay for the work he performed. He worked for 9 months. So how much do you think Mr. Britton should receive as payment for his work? Circled, or we're going to ask the option closest to your views. Let's just those who didn't follow. I have a Mr. Britton who has a contract to work for Mr. Turner for a year, and he gets paid at $10 a month. After 9 months, he quits, and Turner says, "I'm not paying you." And only that, for him to find new workers, he has to pay $15 a month now for the remaining 3 months. And Britton sues because he says, "At least pay me for the first 9 months." So, question: should he do? Britton is in breach of contract. He has forfeited his right to any payments, so he gets $0. That's option 1. Option 2, he should get $90. Britton worked for 9 out of 12 months. He should be paid prorated for 9 months. Or option 3 would be $75 because Britton would have been entitled to a pro rata pay of $90, but his breach of contract forced Turner to hire a replacement at a greater cost. Turner's loss from the affair totals $15, so this should be deducted from Britton's pay.
Too complicated.
It depends
No,
on the
you have to
reason.
actually
Depends
read-
on the reason.
read the
Depends on the
terms.
reason why he stopped working.
Huh?
What if he got sick and that's why he.
Let's say he didn't get sick. He just chose enough
Why he
work.
didn't get paid monthly?
Huh?
Why he didn't get paid monthly?
The contract, so they was a contract, going to pay for a year. It's going to work for a year.
Bad negotiations.
Bad negotiation.
Let's
He
look
had
at
a-
the-
He didn't hire Mark as a lawyer.
Change the manager.
Huh?
Change the manager.
That's right. I think you should get the $90.
You think you should get the
I
$90?
think she should get 75.
75. Anybody think you should get $0 for just quitting?
No.
What do you think? $0? Okay.
Some probably would.
Huh?
75.
I realized why.
Anybody on Zoom want to chime in?
I just realized why you have problem with judges.
No. I'm on the bench.
Depends how much you bribe the judge, you said.
That's right.
All right.
My question, why $10 a month? What does this pay?
1834, yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Well, the poor-
In ancient world, there were 2 main ways of dealing with this issue. One was called debtor prison, that in which a debtor were held until they paid the debt. Or someone else will do it for them. This was in case 1, right? Or the second method was debt bondage, which the person was forced to work in order to repay the debt. Talking about in case 1, where the person did not pay his debt and just doesn't want to do anything. So in olden times, they would actually either put them in prison or force them for labor. In Torah law, in Jewish law, and the Talmud discusses at length, we can only seize assets. You can seize assets where you have to leave the person enough money to live at minimum. But there's never ever allowed to imprison a person. So this debtor prison idea that used to be around for many, many, many years till we have the 13th Amendment, or even then. Look how Maimonides writes here, text 8. Scripture establishes that when creditors demand payment of debts and the debtor owns assets, the debtor's existential needs must be first be provided for, following which the remainder of the debtor assets are granted to the creditor. If the debtor owns no assets, or if the assets are only sufficient to provide for the existential needs, then nothing can be done to the debtor and they may not be imprisoned. Why? Because the Torah forbids to limit a person's freedom. Simple takes it that extreme. We're never allowed to imprison a person or force them even to work, because that limits their freedom, because we're only servants to Hashem, not servants to other people, period. That creates problems, right? In both cases, in both views, it creates problem, because what kind of system do you have then when people take advantage of the system, right? On the other hand, we need to protect people's freedom. So in case study A, they asked Rabbeinu Usher this question, and he responds in text 9 that Shimon's request that Reuven work in order to repay his debt is not something that the court can compel. The court cannot extend its jurisdiction over Reuven's actual person by compelling him to perform work in order to repay his debt. Now, remember in the other classes, we talked about there is legal obligation, and then there's also what we call religious obligation or spiritual obligation. Because as Jews, we're not about just getting by the law, meaning it's not a checklist. We will look at life and law, so we have obligations. It's not about matter what's my right. My right, if it's all about my right, then Reuven could say, I don't care. I have no money. Can't force me to go to work. I have no money. But Judaism, we take it further, where we want question is not what's my right, what's my obligation to each other. That problem, though, is that obligation sometimes cannot be enforced. It can be encouraged, right? So if this Reuven will go to his rabbi and ask his rabbi, what should I do? Should I go to work or shouldn't I go to work, right? We would hope that the rabbi would encourage him or tell him, you be a mensch, not just a mensch, but you have an obligation to go work to pay back the debt that you have. We have this here all the time, right? People who owe money and they declare bankruptcy, right? Or they know if they're going to go back to work, open a business, right? Everything gets seized to the old creditor, whatever. We have all these bankruptcy law, not bankruptcy law. We have, you're a professional, I'm not, right? But people take advantage of they get sued. They put everything else in somebody else's name. You know how it works. The story, the rabbi calls somebody, a new guy comes to shul, and he goes over and says, I want to give you an aliyah, what's your name? And he says, my name is Esther. He says, he's a man. He says, no, what's your name? So everything's in my wife's name.
That's very good. That's good.
You can always hire them,
Okay. So this debt bondage, right? That worked for many years, but we have the 13th Amendment, right? What's the 13th Amendment, Mark? Abolishment of slavery. However, the 13th Amendment comes with one notable exception, and that's called penal labor. What's penal labor? A punishment for a crime a person performed, right? They go to prison. What do they do in prison? They have to work. They're forced to work in prison, right? So penal labor is practiced today, right? Where inmates can be compelled to work. Only time they have to work, so unless there's a medical issue, they are forced to work, and they work for nothing. They work for nothing. Why? Firstly, they're paying up for what they owe, right? Or they're paying rent in prison. The whole prison system is not a Jewish idea, by the way. The whole prison system is not a Jewish idea. We learned in the other course, I think we had that course 2 years ago, how Torah doesn't look at prison as only if it's if somebody's a danger to society, in extreme cases, we put in prison, but now prison is a way to force somebody to work or to pay up for something. Rather, Torah looks as we need to help bring the person to repent and to rehabilitate, etc. So let's look at text 10, prison labor. We need somebody to read. Who has a book? Mitzvah, can you read us text 10, page 117, loud?
Once cleared by the prison doctor, inmates can be forced to work under threat of punishment as severe as solitary confinement. Legally, this labor may be totally uncompensated. More typically, inmates are paid legally as little as 2 cents per hour for their full-time work in the field, manufacturing, warehousing, or kitchens. How is this legal? Isn't the 13th Amendment abolish all forms of slavery and involuntary servitude in this country? Not quite. The defining promise of freedom was the 13th Amendment. Charleston's exception is carved out. Section 1 of the amendment provides neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except for punishment for crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Now, this is in the United States, or any place subject to jurisdiction. Simply put, incarcerated persons have no constitutional rights in the area and can be forced to work as punishment for the crime.
So it's contradictory.
What? What's contradictory?
Well, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall have been duly, shall exist within the United States, but then they have an exception.
Right, there's an exception to the 13th Amendment.
So that's contradictory.
Well,
It's exception.
it's called exception.
That's right.
The law, that's the law. That's, that people screaming, the prison system is another form of slavery, basically. And America is very, has the harshest prison system than any other Western country. Huh? Yes?
Compared to all the prisons in South America, all the ones.
That's a Western civilized country.
Okay. All right, fair enough.
Not China, not China. But we have also the largest prison population.
I don't think they in slavery, they just using our money to feed them, to pay them. They
Okay.
are in prison like. I mean,
Yes.
We should move there. We don't have to pay them.
Yeah, they should be.
Well, the other problem is that in Europe, in some Europe countries, I don't want to open up a can about prison system, but in some Europe, like in Sweden, the prison is like a 5-star hotel. People want to perform crimes, they can go to prison. But it's fundamentally a whole different approach, because Judaism really is concerned about the person, the offender. We need to do everything to help to get the offender back into society properly. With the prison system as we have it today, it's a far cry of helping a person to come back. Right? We just lock them up, and as a result, the big percentage of them return to crime when they come out of prison. So we have accomplished absolutely nothing. But that was a whole course on that. But yes.
So what happens in Israel today?
Good question. What happens in Israel today? I want to say something that some people don't know. Israel does not follow Torah law.
Right.
Israel follows Western civilization, democracy law, and many times that's a big clash where Jewish values are totally ignored in Israel, or fought against actually, which makes it sometimes very painful to watch in our Jewish states. If it's a Jewish state, why don't we follow some Jewish law? But that's for a whole, that could be another course. That could be another course. Yes, I just a nice story I saw over Shavuot there's a lady in Queens. She was an 8-year-old, came off the boats after the war. She lost her entire family, and when she came off the boat in Israel to start a new life, there was a big push that all these kids should go into very secular kibbutz, where they are stripped from any religious observance because they wanted people just to live a secular life in Israel. And this 80-year-old girl comes and this guy tells her, you're going to go to this kibbutz, very secular kibbutz. So she says to the guy, tell me, in this kibbutz, they do this? He said, what do you mean by that? She remembers, as a child, her mother lighting the Shabbos candles. And he says, no, because then I'm not going with you. He went back and said, well, this girl needs to go to a religious kibbutz. And so they assigned her to a religious kibbutz. Today, she's a 89-year-old lady with many, many grandchildren all doing this. All doing this. All right, yes, more questions?
It's- When you're talking about Western law and Jewish law,
Mhm.
there are so many different offshoots. For instance, justice is blind with scales that don't bend. If you take a look at our Western laws,
Mhm.
now, let's say I said that person should not get no money at all because you said, that's my understanding, that person made a choice. I am not going to work anymore to pay this off.
Mhm.
Therefore, he is reneging on that contract.
Mhm.
Now, sometimes you sit there and say, well, wait a minute. What if the man that gave him the money literally said, I know you're behind the barrel. I know that if you're really worth this much, but I am going to make you do this. And whatever, life and death, it's for Operation Kid, whatever.
Mhm.
Okay, so the man says, you know what? I've worked 6 times what you, or 5 times, or twice what you deserve,
Mhm.
and I have made a choice that you have had enough based on that. But that was not the original agreement. So who's right on that? Is it the man that's messing this other man out of money, or is it the man that was put in a position?
There's no question that the guy's messing up is wrong. The question is, how can we enforce him to pay it back?
If you're looking at Jewish law,
Sure.
and I understand that's why rabbis have, and that's why we have parshas, and that's why we have haftorahs, and that's why we have all these little tiny little rules.
Mhm.
But the bottom line is, we know what is morally right,
Mhm.
and the only equalizer to me, and that's what I could never understand, is that if you follow Torah, you're always going to be okay. Period.
Who said that? Yeah.
Anything I've ever heard that if you
Which rabbi ever said that?
this is what I've heard from, well, actually, even the Rebbe, he says, as long as you follow Torah, and I listened to some different people talking, but to me,
Let me interrupt you. I'm so sorry, because we have to move on to class, but just say one thing. What we do between us and God is our own choice, right? We have a choice with how I serve Hashem, and that's where Torah is our guide. One second. That's our guide. As a guide. However, and we also have our guide how to act towards others, and we learned in the other classes how we have a responsibility for each other, and we have our duties. However, the clash happens when we deal with other people who go against that belief, and now what do? And then in that point, there's also guidance in Torah how I, as the victim, so to speak, have to respond. Do I have to respond? Well, I just swallow it. There are these laws and guidance that come into place. And in a society with people, you're always going to have that clash, but Torah gives us a very strong direction, and we have to educate people from young on wise to go beyond the letter of the law, to look out for each other. The fight shouldn't be that you owe me money. The fight should be, how can I help you, right? How can I give you back before more than my obligations, etc. Now that's ideal. So we need to train people to be mentioned, not to see how can I get away with my life by just saying mind my own business, right? If in America we very much stress it, it's all about my rights, and my rights clash with your rights, tough luck. In Judaism, we emphasize I have a responsibility for each other. Let's move on because yes. But if it would be perfect, then we wouldn't have a problem. We wouldn't have we would be just angels. We wouldn't be humans.
Is there an answer to that? Should the man have paid?
We're not finished. We'll see soon.
Oh, okay.
We're trying to solve it. So far, we said that he must pay, but we can force him into forced labor or into a prison. That's what we said. And we could take away his assets. Not that we said, we obligated to take away all his assets, with exception of his basic living. That is Torah. But I can't force it. I'm going to skip text 11 because it's on the idea of that prison, how terrible that was in other countries, like in England, where people literally were in prison for 30 years and died in prison just for owing money. So that's the answer to question number 1 about Reuven. So let's look at text 12. Oh, sorry, here's a new case. Here's a new case. A new case as follows. This happened in Spain. It happened in Spain in the 14th century. So a Jew by the name Reuven borrowed money from a name Shimon again, right? So let's read text 12. Reuven borrowed money from Shimon. In the contract, Reuven put up his personal freedom as collateral. For so is the law of Aragon, which is today not in Spain. If a debtor does not own available assets from which he is dead, can be repaid, he is incarcerated. So in other words, the local law in Spain was that if you don't pay your debt, you go into debt prison. Jewish law says you can't do that. However, Reuven in the contract said, I guarantee the loan that if I cannot pay, I'm voluntarily right now in the contract will agree to follow the law of the land, so to speak, right? Now, Shimon the creditor now demands the repayment of his loan, but Reuven has no assets for which to pay. Shimon requests that Reuven be imprisoned as he was agreed to in advance. Reuven argues that he cannot be imprisoned for his debt because there is no precedent in Jewish law for a person to be imprisoned due to his debt. You requested my opinion on the law in such a case. That was a question that was asked to Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshet. So what do you say? What do you say? Can he be imprisoned? But he himself said, I'm ready to be imprisoned. Doesn't matter. Jewish law sides through the Reuven the debtor, a person cannot consent to his incarceration. The Torah states that children of Israel belong to me as servants, from which we derive that they cannot be made servants to other servants. No contract clause can allow for a person to be compelled to work, not even his regular vocation. It goes without saying that no clause can allow for a person to be imprisoned and made to languish in a dark dungeon. All right? So the Jewish standard is kind of universal. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Now, it doesn't solve necessarily the issue. We have an issue at hand, but just saying go language in prison is not the solution either. Rather, Torah is very clear. That's number 1 on the whole idea of owing money to somebody else. Let's move to the workers' freedom. Let's talk about workers' freedom. Right? Next topic. And we're going to kind of take what we learned till now, apply it. How do we deal with workers that quit, right? The obligations that workers have to each other. So we live in Florida, right? You hire people, and what happens? Either they don't show up or they quit in the middle, right? Or they start their job and then they don't come back. Right? Happens very quick. So you have first thing in Florida or anywhere else, you need to have a good lawyer. You need to have a good lawyer. All right. What is the question about? Can I, as a employee, do I have the freedom to quit? Right. So what do you think? Always have freedom to quit, right? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Everybody has freedom to quit, so to speak. However, the question is, at whose cost? Whose cost? That gets more complicated, right? Not mine. All right, so text 13, right? What's it, the joke of the guy drives down the road and he sees 2 workers on the side of the road, 2 city workers. One digs a hole and the other one fills the hole. And he sees the guy in they go next 6 feet. The guy makes a hole, the other guy fills the hole. He goes over and says, what's going on over here? Explain what you're doing. He said, very simple. Every day we have 3 workers. One makes the hole, one plants the tree, and the other one fills the hole. Just because the other guy didn't show up to work, we shouldn't work today. Sounds familiar. Right? So here's text 13 from the Talmud. Right? This is why the Talmud makes us think. Talmud teaches us how to think and how to A worker has the right, page 121. A worker has the right to withdraw from their employment even in the middle of the working day. But you said earlier that he has a right. Why does he have the right? Because you're thinking about, that's the law in America, right? We have a freedom. Right? Nobody can enslave me, so to speak. I can quit. The right emerges from the verse in Torah, the children of Israel belong to me as servants, whereby God is stating, they are my servants, not servants to other servants, right? So, now, text 14, who has to pay? Do you have to pay him for the partial work? Remember, we had the case of Mr., what's his name? Britain, right, who resigned in middle and wants payments. If I quit in the middle of the day, what is my obligation about? Does the employer have to pay him? Text 14 in the Talmud. Actually, it's not from the commentary in the Talmud. An employee has the right to quit their job even in the middle of the day, and they're given the upper hand when calculating the pay they are entitled to receive. Who has the upper hand? The employee. The quitting employee is entitled to payment for the value of work accomplished before quitting. This remains true even if the market rate for such work has since risen, leaving the employer unable to hire another worker to complete the job with the remainder of their funds. For example, an employee was hired for 8 dinners per day, but quit halfway through the first day. Even if the cost of the particular form of labor has now risen to 12 dinars per day, so that a replacement worker for the second half of the day will charge 6 dinars, the quitting employee must still be paid 4 dinars for the half day of work. We do not protect the employer from having to pay more than the 8 dinars that originally intended to pay by deducting the expense of the replacement workers from the quitting workers' pay, which would leave the latter with only 2 dinars. So very clear that what? He has a right, they have a right to quit, and he must be paid whatever the agreement was, right? If it's a half a day for 8 dinars is 4 dinars, right? And it doesn't matter if now the employer needs to hire somebody for more money, we don't deduct that money that the employer has to pay more to the first worker. Why? Because Torah looks at the person has always his freedom, he can quit, and he has the upper hand. Why did I say the upper hand? Because the Torah never want to give the employer, so to speak, an upper hand. That's already a quote unquote enslavement, limiting somebody's liberty. This is law written 2,000 years ago, not in today's day and age. Yes.
I'm surprised
That's
Jewish
it.
working.
Huh?
As an example, even under federal labor law.
Yeah.
If you have somebody working for you and they quit.
Yep.
And maybe they have your laptop at home.
Mm-hmm.
They take company laptop and it's at home. And you cannot hold their paycheck until they bring the laptop back. You have to pay that person
Mhm.
and then go after them by calling the police or filing a suit or whatever.
Nobody
So
wants to
you
work.
have to pay them
That's
money
it.
that
That's what I
they-
said. I'm surprised.
Right, but what does secular law, what does American law say in regards that now you broke your contract, right? You were supposed to work the full day, like in Mr. Britton's case, right? Does my quitting middle of the day is gonna now require me to pay more? Who has the upper hand? The employee? You can't
take money.
You can't take away money from them. So you're saying that American law, just like Jewish law, what's the answer? Got to pay him and we have a business lawyer here, and he says what?
You absolutely can, because so the difference between employee working and contract. What's the difference?
Okay.
There's a contract. If there's a contract,
Oh,
and you breach the contract, which is done here,
okay.
in American law, the contract says to make whole, so if it costs more to finish that, and there is a duty you have to minimize. I can't go hire someone for 30 dinars just because I feel like it.
Right.
I have to do what I can to minimize my cost, but that cost then can be owed to me by
By the first worker.
the person.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. But Jewish law says no. We still want to see the Jewish an employee and a contractor. A contract.
That's what I'm saying, you know,
We're actually gonna see in Torah, there's actually the same difference in a sense. But number one, we're talking about employee, employer. That the employee always has the upper hand with one exception. If his quitting actually causes irreplaceable loss to the employer. This is in the next text, in irreversible loss, text 15. If the work was time sensitive and the neglects will cause irreversible damage, the quitting employee has the lower hand in calculating of wages. For example, workers hired to remove flax from the water was soaked in, right? If the flax is not functionally removed from the water, it will decay. And now, okay, I'm quitting in the middle. If it's extenuating circumstance such as illness or death, or for a family member, the employee has the right to quit. I'll retain the upper hand in the calculation of the wages. Absence of circumstances, the employee is given the lower hand when calculating their pay because quitting prematurely will cause the employer an irreversible loss. All right, so with the exception of him causing the loss by quitting, then he always has the upper hand. Even if there's a death in the family, he must leave, then he must leave. Even if there's a loss, then he still has the upper hand. Employees versus contract in text 16, it changes everything. Why? Because an employee, you're already in a certain sense bound to somebody else. A contractor is independent. So Torah not so much concerned about his freedom. In that case, if the contractor quits in the middle, now he has the lower hand. Look at text 16. The law granting an employee the right to quit does not extend to independent contractors. This is in Rashi in the Talmud. An employee is protected by the principle implied in the verse. They are my servant, not servants to other servants, but this does not apply to independent contractors, for the contractors serve only themselves. So the contractor has the lower hand in his case.
So the Torah is saying that independent contractors can't follow the Torah and actually serve.
Say again?
So the Torah is saying that independent contractors can't serve, you know,
They can't serve.
they can't serve, you know, God can't serve on the Torah because they're only serving themselves.
No. I think that's the point. That's not the point about serving themselves. Okay. No, actually, serving themselves meaning they're not serving another boss, right? They don't have a boss on top of them, right? And the fact they don't have a boss puts that now it's literally two people. It's not my freedom over somebody else's freedom, so to speak, which puts the contractor in a lower hand if he breaches his contract. Here in my book, it says, like you said, Mark, that American law always gives the quitting worker, like Britain, the lower hand and deduct any added expenses for their pay. In Jewish law, will be a difference between if he's a contractor or if he's an employee. An employee, he has the right to quit as long as there's no real loss. The loss that he has to go and hire more expensive worker is not considered a loss that we take away from the first worker. A contractor, he has a contract that'll finish the job. You quit, then you gotta pay for the damages.
Like you said, even under US law, if it's an employee, no matter what, you have to pay him. Now, you can go after him after all the extra stuff, no problem. You can eventually go
What
after
are
him,
you
but
gonna
Jewish law says you can't.
Right.
Take you 100
Hey, you
years.
gave him money, he's got your money. You go after him, right back. You gotta pay him
Takes you
first.
100
Are we gonna
years.
go back to the original case? or-
The original case of the slave?
Yeah.
That's a good question. We're gonna go back to the original case of the slave. Well, we would say, it's Torah law doesn't believe in slavery in the first place, right? Can't even have Betty as a slave in the first place. So if she chooses to be a slave, in a sense,
It's just a different
Huh?
employment, it's an employment.
well, maybe switch the word employment, right? Don't say that's.
She's free to go,
But they're back, yeah. I don't know. That's I think was what the point was to bring out to teach us to see us the different viewpoints here. All right, let's recap quick on the screen and then we wrap up this class today. Western democracy, slave is abolished, but forced penal labor still exists. In Jewish law, oath-based labor is banned. Jewish law allows an employee to quit at any time without penalty, paid in full, unless doing so will cause the employer
Wrong word.
irreversible loss. That would be the word. Self-employed. What's the here? There's a little question on page 124, exercise 24. Record a single word to describe the greatest benefit in working for yourself.
Freedom.
Autonomy. Autonomy, right? And record a single word to describe the greatest benefit in working for an employer.
Get paid.
Security, very good. All right, and record a single word to describe the most significant drawback in working for yourself.
Lack of security.
Record a single word to describe the most significant drawback in working for an employer.
Call him boss.
Answer.
Um,
Someone.
Yeah.
we're good.
We have nobody to yell at.
All right, so then be free from anyone and free from anything. To be free, we must be ourselves in general, and this is just a practical application. Look at text 17. This is a little beautiful poem that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi expressed. Servants of time are servants of servants. A servant of God alone is free. Therefore, when each person seeks their portion, my portion is God, says my soul for me. What does he mean by the servant of time? Huh? What do you mean by servant of time? Huh? Deadlines, right? Deadlines. When you have deadlines in life, or you have I have to do this, I have to do that. All those limits your inner freedom. So to be free, we must be ourselves, expressing our identity, our godly spark. And this is somewhere we can always improve, right? Only God is above time. And by allowing our spark, our godly spark within ourselves to express, we can be essentially free. This is the today's class.
Lesson 4. Beyond personal freedom. 1. Judaism teaches that true freedom is living the life we were created to live. This requires freedom from human masters and devotion to God as the one true master. 2. In the past, people could be forced into slavery for failing to repay debts. Even today, prisoners can be legally compelled to work. By contrast, Jewish law does not allow for anyone to be compelled to work against their will. 3. Debt prison was another once ubiquitous tool for debt recovery. Jewish law has always banned debt prisons, even when stipulated in a loan agreement. 4. The employer-employee relationship requires an employee to surrender a certain degree of their freedom. Jewish law protects employees from veering too close to slavery by guaranteeing their right to quit mid-contract without penalty, unless doing so would cause the employer irretrievable loss.
All right, next week we'll learn about the lawful ownership. If I find an object on the street, what is my requirement to return it or not required? Can I keep something that belongs to somebody else? That will be next week. It's a whole tract in the Talmud. That's exciting debates on that, and I look forward to teaching it next week. Yeah, I have to run shortly. I have a funeral to run to, but yes.
Isn't there indentured servant, and if he wants to work for a certain amount of time, he gets to leave at the end, and it's indentured servitude is very much like slavery.
Yep.
But in that time, if he should take a wife and have children, the wife and child have to stay with that owner, and then the man is allowed to leave. Is that not true?
That goes into the whole topic we spoke in the beginning, right? Which is not the, it's, which is which is not so, it's not what the Torah wants a person to do. Person chooses to do so. He says, I like my master and my wife and my children, I want them to be together. Any point that he wants to go free, problem is that he is like in a contract because he sold himself to pay. He owes money, so he sold his work. So, but the maximum person can be a Jewish servant is 6 years. 6 years. If he wants to stay longer, we put him by the start of the year. All right? I have to run. I'm so sorry. It was good to see everyone on Zoom. You have a quick question, Bella? Yeah.
Not about class, about the funeral. Where is it in that, how to find it? Is it
Just stop the recording.